Pardon the interruption. I'm Sam Mulberry, joined as always by
Annie Berglund. Hey, Sam, can you give us a little reminder of how Wednesday's exam is going to work?
Yeah, so first thing, remember that tomorrow, July 4th, is the 4th of July, which is a national holiday. So we're not having you take an exam on the 4th of July. So for tomorrow, it's just take the day off, enjoy the holiday. If you want to study a little bit, that's great too. The test will be on Wednesday, July 5th. And First off, you have a window between 3 and 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. So anytime during that time period, you can go into Moodle and start the exam. After 7, it will close. So you need to make sure you get it started before then. You will have a 75-minute window once you start the exam. So once you start the exam, a 75-minute clock will start ticking for that exam. Now, we've taught this course. I think this is the 11th time we've taught this course in the summer. 75 minutes is plenty of time to take this exam and to do well on this exam. Now, I will say the exam is open note and open book. So that's both very helpful, right? Because you can use those things as you're taking the exam. But there's also a danger in that. Because you only have 75 minutes, that's plenty of time, but it's not plenty of time if you find yourself looking up every answer to the exam. If you're doing that, if you're looking up every quote, every multiple choice question, everything like that, you will get to the essay and you will run out of time. So make sure that that you're not just leaning on the fact that you can go to your notes or your book, but like really be studying, reviewing this stuff. The other thing that's really helpful is make sure your notes are organized. The more organized you are with your notes, the easier it's going to be to go in and access those things. So you'll have a 75-minute window. Now, the last question on the test is the essay question, which will be based on those essay themes in the study guide. Now, just because it's the last question doesn't mean that that needs to be the last thing that you do. I would think about how you manage your time a little bit on this exam. So, for example, make sure you're giving yourself probably a solid 20 minutes on that essay to make sure you're writing a good, complete essay that's drawing on sources, things like this. Because again, since it's open note and open book, my expectations for an essay like that are that, you're going to actually be pulling details from the museums and the films and the reading packet, that I'm going to be seeing those things. And a answer to that essay question is going to be drawing on specific details. So that's a little bit about the test. Annie, besides the essay, one of the more difficult questions on the exam are connection questions. Can you talk a little bit about what connection questions are and how students can maybe prepare for them?
Sure. So with connection questions, what we're basically doing is saying, okay, we have two mastery terms listed, given to you. How would you connect these two terms? And oftentimes they're not terms from even the same decade, same century. They're terms across that unit. And sometimes we even go back to previous units, as you'll see in your Unit 2 and Unit 3 exam. So it's really important that you are keeping up on studying those terms. Even when Unit 1 is done, you might still see some of those big players, some of those big mastery terms in later sections. So I have 4 pieces of advice. First piece of advice is one that actually, Sam, you had given me before as a student. And it's ties into like using details from the reading, as you were mentioning earlier. But you had told me some answers are correct without being complete. And so what the idea is like, okay, you might be factually correct in your connections between these two, but it might not be complete in that you're not really thinking about the context of the class as you are making this connection. Oftentimes, we do talk about the connections quite explicitly in lectures or other materials in the course. And so it's not just enough to say, okay, these two are from a similar era, or they are both talking about this topic. But you want to dive into the readings and be really specific with your details, which brings me to the second point. Don't forget to include context details. So with a connection, it's not just enough to say, oh, Plato is connected to Aristotle because blah, blah, blah. The connection portion is really important and the bulk of what you're arguing. But before you get to how two terms connect, you should be building the context for those two terms, right? How can you lead into their connection? So like if one of the terms is Plato, it's not just enough to say he's a Greek philosopher. Like, okay, that is his context. You're right. That's correct. But that's also not complete. We need more information about where did he live? When did he live? What ideas do we attribute to him? How was he influential? Because you're essentially building the case for that connection. So there are some things about Plato you might not mention because maybe it's not relevant to the connection between him and, say, Aristotle, or him and whatever other term we could connect him with. Essentially, think of it as writing a mini ID term: who, what, when, where, and their influences, before you get into how these two terms connect. So when we're building it, kind of think of it like an upside down triangle, where you have at the top a lot of the detail information and you're honing it in to the bottom to how those two terms can connect. Third, think about the themes of the class, the themes that those individuals can connect to. So for example, in Unit 1, one really big theme we have is justice and just laws. So if you take that theme, you can try to connect either in a map that you write yourself, or as you're thinking about it, connect what terms you think would go with that theme. Who has a perspective on civil disobedience or on just laws that we've read about in Unit 1? And start thinking, oh, Antigone had something to say about that. So did MLK Jr. So did Plato's account of Socrates' death. So then you start saying, okay, all of these people have connections to that theme. Perhaps Professor Mulberry is going to ask me to connect two terms with the theme justice. So it helps you kind of organize in your mind who might be connected in advance of taking the test. And then the fourth piece of advice is one that Sam has already mentioned, which is give yourself time. So like he said, an open book exam gives us kind of the trap of using our notes and depending upon our notes. I would say the things you should really study in advance and try to memorize as much as possible is things like the map and the timeline, so that you spend less time digging through your notes trying to remember dates and facts, and then you have more time for the objective portion of the exam, which is the writing, right? The more time for building these connections. So those are kind of my main pieces of advice as you go into the connection questions. Sam, to review early Christianity, on the last worksheet, we asked students to talk about two early Christian debates over canon and theology that were significant to them. What's an early church debate that you find especially important to this day?
I think one that's really important is one that I think we sometimes brush past, which is the debate over Gnosticism. So the Gnostics are this group of early Christians in sort of the first, second century AD. And in the museum, it talks about how the Gnostics sort of absorb aspects of Greek philosophy, and particularly this sort of dualism that comes out of, kind of spins out of Platonic thinking, right? So this idea that the spiritual things are good, physical, material things are evil. And then they sort of reinterpret the Bible based on that, right? Because if matter and physical and flesh is evil, then the idea of the incarnation doesn't make any sense. Why would a good spiritual God become physical? Because that's evil, right? Now, I think there's a degree to which, I think a 21st century Christian might look at that and say, like, well, that really doesn't have a major application to my life and my spirituality. But here's why I think that debate's important. Because the rejection of Gnosticism points to the idea that Christianity is something that's embodied. That Christianity isn't just about the spiritual, right? It isn't just about the world to come or ideas or beliefs or spiritual things, but that If you think about the book of Genesis, right, the Bible starts with the creation of the physical world. God creates the world and calls it good. And then we get the fall of creation. But then this is a story about redemption, right? So I think one of those tensions, and I think modern Christians can fall into this almost Gnostic trap of thinking about Christianity and spirituality really as this spiritual thing and rejecting the physical rather than embracing elements of the physical. We're rejecting an embodied faith, a faith that is not just believed but is lived out, a faith that exists in practice and exists in physical proximity to each other, in life together, things like that. So I actually think that Gnostic debate, although at first it might seem like a strange artifact of the past, actually has a lot for us to think about as contemporary Christians. And I think I will catch myself sometimes and I'll think about things I'm thinking or saying and say like, wow, I'm starting to sound a little Gnostic there. Like I need to embody these ideas a little bit more. So I do think that physical aspect is really, really important. Annie, one of the big pivot points of the early church is the reign of Emperor Constantine. It's sort of a paradigm shift or plot twist in our story. Why is he so significant?
I think it all boils down to identity. And I'll explain that a little bit, but when we think about the big questions of CWC, it's like, who am I? Who am I in relationship to others? How do I know that? How have I figured that out about myself, right? And those are big questions that Christians wrestle with pre and post Constantine, and there is a divide between how Christians identify themselves because of the Edict of Milan. And so we have a church in the early first couple centuries, AD, like hundreds, 200s, where you're a small, like family unit kind of church. You're underground, you're separate from each other. And the big identity is that I'm a Christian, which means I am persecuted. I'm a Christian, which means I do not belong in the empire. I'm a Christian, which means I'm outside of culture and I'm perceived as being strange or different or dangerous by the vast majority of people around me. And so you go from a church that is small, that is separated physically, that is underground, to a church after toleration with the Edict of Milan in the 300s, to not being persecuted, to being able to be out in the open, and to be a church that is growing. And so we don't have these small churches underground anymore, and instead the identity grows to one of power. And this is still gradual, but we start to see Christians reckon with and struggle with, what do we do when we are now a church that is no longer identified by its persecution, and now our identity is in power, prestige, authority, and it becomes almost, you could say, financially helpful to be a Christian, right? Certainly it becomes an area or an identity factor that could get you like a promotion in 2020 terms, right? 2023 terms, or it could get you more power in the government. And so the number of Christians grows, Christianity is becoming tolerated, persecutions are waning, it's easier to become a Christian, and Christians are appointed to places of power, and the church and state begin to join. And with that joining comes another big change in identity, which is with Constantine, we have a change in how the church makes decisions. And so, like Sam was saying previously, we have more and more these debates on doctrine because people are trying to flesh out what it means to be Christian. Once Jesus dies and resurrects, there's still many questions hanging in the air of who we are. And certainly after Constantine, we start seeing debates, and it's not just religious leaders who have a say in these debates, but Constantine brings in councils like the Council of Nicaea to settle debates. And it could be debates on whether the Son had been begotten by the Father from his own being, and therefore having no beginning, or else created out of nothing. Or it could be a debate on, are the Father and Son one in divine purpose only, or are they also one in being? And you have hundreds of bishops and delegates from all over the Roman Empire attending these councils to try to determine what we are going to believe going forward. What is our doctrine of belief? And then when Christianity moves from being tolerated to be the official religion of the land, which doesn't come till later, it doesn't come till Unit 2, we see how the church and state become even more interconnected and they become joint. And there's clear advantages with that, certainly with a lack of persecution, but there's some also troubling disadvantages of what it means to be a Christian when we do have it so connected to our political systems and when we do benefit from being a Christian. And so it's this constant shift in identity that is something that we still wrestle with today in 21st century America, of what does it mean to be a Christian when we aren't tied specifically to those early Christians who were persecuted. And much of the Bible, much of the New Testament shows that identity to us of how do we endure persecution and still and do it happily and with joy, looking for the next life. What is a Christian when we don't have that factor? So those are kind of the big changes with Constantine and the Edict of Milan, especially on an individual level as an individual Christian. So Sam, another important figure in this unit, some might argue, I think maybe you might argue, one of the most important in this unit and in this class is Augustine. So why has Augustine been such a central figure in CWC?
I think that's an interesting question. If, as you point out, Constantine is this sort of paradigm shift where the world changes, and Augustine is one of the big people who helps interpret that change and think about that change. I want to point to three things with Augustine that I think are really important. For one thing, writing a book like Confessions is really significant. I mean, it is a spiritual autobiography, one of the first in the Western tradition, one of the first in the Christian tradition. So he's writing about the experience of God, which is significant because one of the things we're going to talk about throughout this course is like, where do we look for authority and answers? And Christians look to the Bible, but they also look to things like the church and traditions and things like this. But another place they look is to experience. And Augustine's Christianity is shaped by all of those things, but experience is a big one of them. So a second thing is theological debates. So we talked about his debates with Pelagius, with the Donatists, and in these debates, he is shaping church doctrine. He's shaping the doctrine of the church as we move forward into the Middle Ages. So in this way, he's a transition figure. I think he's central because he both understands the ancient world and the early church world, but he also is alive at this unique moment in history and has a unique genius to understand how the world is changing. So through his theological work, he helps to shape what the Church of the Middle Ages is going to look like. And that is the church is the most essential institution of the Middle Ages. So Augustine is really important for that. I mean, there's a degree to which you cannot do Western Christian theology without wrestling with Augustine. Even if you disagree with everything that he says, the shadow that he casts, the footprint that he leaves is so big that you have to know your Augustine and you have to wrestle with Augustine. He just needs to be reckoned with. And then the third thing is City of God. And City of God connects to what you were talking about with Constantine, because here's where he's really saying, like, how do Christians live in this new world where they have power, where they have comfort, where they have wealth? How do Christians think about how do we live in this world? What should our relationship to this world be? Particularly, what should our relationship to this government be, to the Roman Empire, as the empire is collapsing? Should we care about the empire collapsing? Should we try to support it? Should we say good riddance? There are Christians at the time who think if the empire collapses, does that mean the kingdom of God is collapsing because the empire has become so thoroughly Christian? Augustine's wrestling with all of those questions, right? And he tells his readers and his followers, he says, we should support the things of this world, the institutions of this world, to the degree that they do seek good, right? A government seeks peace, but we should hold those things lightly, because the peace that a worldly government is going to seek after is going to be a temporary peace. It's going to be a peace achieved through war or maintained with violence, compared to the peace of the kingdom of God, which is eternal and comes about through love. Now, peace is good either way, but We should hold loosely the things of this world, but we should hold them because God has put us here for a reason as pilgrims and sojourners in this world. So I think Augustine is just at the end of Unit 1 is there to interpret Unit 1 for us and help us think about how do Christians wrestle with everything that has happened. He's looking to the Bible, he's looking to experience, he's looking to Greek philosophy, he leans a lot on Plato. So I think understanding Augustine really takes us a long way to thinking about some of the biggest things we talk about in this class. Annie? That's all the time that we have for segment 1 of this course. We're going to be back in a few seconds to play a little game called Food Chain, where we're going to debate the 5 most important figures from Unit 1 of CWC. And we're back. Annie, we're going to play a little game called Food Chain. We've each made our lists of the 5 most important figures from Unit 1 of CWC. So this is a chance for us to kind of make our case for why we think these people are important and to review some of the most important people we've looked at in this unit as students are preparing for exams. Who do you have at number 5 on your list?
Okay, so looking back at this list, I feel like it's a little bit strange, but that's okay. I'm going to stand by it, and I love a challenge. So Tertullian is my number 5. And I think Tertullian is often overlooked on lists like these. So here's my argument for him. A big theme in the early church, which we've talked about already, is doctrine and heresy, right? What are we defining as our core beliefs, and what is on the outside of those beliefs that we would say is heretical? And I think that Tertullian is one of the key voices in Unit 1 that talks about this. And he does so in a way that is fascinating, that is a little more extreme from our perspective now. And he also has other lasting legacies even outside of that theme of doctrine versus heresy. So Tertullian is also an important character in Unit 1 because he comes from a hub of theology in Unit 1, which is North Africa, similar to Augustine, right? And in the 200s, he's a North African apologist. And many of his works are influential and important, like him writing about the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Spirit. And in his works, he also addressed heresies, and he had a lot of harsh things to say about philosophy. And I think that his perspective on it is so fascinating, given that the first large chunk of Unit 1, we are just deep into philosophy. And now we have an individual who identifies himself as a Christian. He's in the early church, and he's saying, oh, okay, philosophy can actually really lead us astray from the core beliefs of Christianity. And so he has these kind of separate spheres of philosophy and Christianity, or philosophy and religion. And he's perhaps saying that like he's more of a moralist than a philosopher. Like he cares more about our actions than about philosophizing, which is an interesting take, especially given the fact that I'm sure on Sam's list somewhere will be Augustine, somebody who is more willing to engage with philosophy than someone like Tertullian. But Tertullian's interesting too, because even though he opposes things like Gnosticism and he sees the damage of Platonic dualism, he is also a product of philosophy himself. He's a product of this mindset because his faith is established through scripture, which, as we've talked about, draws heavily on Platonic thought. So he's a fascinating character. He also has a legacy of Christian pacifism. He's one of the voices that we have in CWC that talks most explicitly about being a pacifist. And certainly there are many other voices, and we don't have time to get to them in CWC. But I think he's a key central figure for that, especially as we move into an era where Christian identity changes with toleration and later on with being a state-backed religion, that we have to wrestle with. Well, if the state goes to war, what is our path as a Christian? What is our path when Jesus has many things to say about turning the other cheek,
about avoiding violence and conflict, right? So how do we wrestle with maintaining peace when we have the words of Jesus saying, go for peace, like live your life with peace, but also wrestling with our new identity in empire. So I think that legacy is going to become even more important as we move forward. And then he's a symbol of the early church as very distinct from the culture around it. So as I mentioned before, in the 100s, 200s AD, we have Christians who are seen as separate, distinct, and oftentimes strange or different or dangerous. And so he is one of those individuals that, because of his beliefs on the cultural differences and the elements of Greek philosophy, we have him setting himself aside and different from the culture around him, the Greek culture. I don't think that Tertullian is better than Augustine. And I don't think he's a more prolific writer even, but I do kind of view him as a predecessor to some of those ideas, some of those debates and topics of Christian identity that Augustine will flesh out more later and in a very different way. I think that he is one of the first theologians in the West that gets to this height of influence. So I think that's an important reason to have Tertullian in number 5. Sam, what is your number 5?
So I went a different direction with number 5. I really like that you have Tertullian on your list. I also have somebody who I think gets overlooked in this course. I'm putting Homer at number 5. And I'm putting Homer here because I think we tend to at times underplay the arts, underplay literature. And the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer is this epic poet. And he does so much to maybe not create Greek culture, but to express Greek culture. That these writings by Homer become these foundational texts to the Greek world about, what it means to be Greek. I can imagine if I, was living in ancient Athens, the stories of Homer would be the kind of things that I would teach to my children to help them understand what it means to be a man or a woman as part of this culture. That we can see Greek ideas, we can see, bravery, courage, cunning, guile, moderation, right, as these big themes that run through all of these. And it also helps us understand kind of how the Greeks thought about the gods. So it's both a cultural text, a text that teaches us about Greek values and teaches the Greeks about their values, but it also helps the Greeks understand what it's like to live in a world dominated by the Greek gods, dominated by gods who have a great deal of power in this world, but are also kind of arbitrary. And right, how do you need to appease the gods, and what happens if you don't? I mean, these stories are full of warnings about what happens if you become immoderate or you don't act virtuously, in the Greek way. So I think Homer's really, really significant for helping to shape and convey the Greek world, and then these become foundational texts to this very day. I mean, I'm guessing some of you listening to this, if you were educated in the West, that at some point in your educational career you encountered in whole or in part the works of Homer, right? That these things have lived on in the Western canon, because I do think they express some sort of truths about not only what it means to be Greek, but what it means to be human. So I'm going to have Homer at number 5 on my list. Not at the very top, but I think it's important that he make the 5. Annie, who do you have at number 4?
Well, I love that you included Homer, especially because somebody who I have later on my list, spoiler alert, is Alexander the Great, who read Homer. And you can kind of see, I mean, it's not that hard to connect some of his actions as a conqueror to some of the things he probably read in Homer and his love of Greek culture. So I think that is a wonderful addition to the list. I do not have Homer as number 4. Instead, I have Constantine. So I've already talked a lot about Constantine as a hinge figure of the early church to a more established, larger church, a more active church with the culture around it, and certainly one that has now been moving towards interacting, engaging with culture, because before that was not as much an option as a persecuted, smaller, separate church.
So Constantine is important in shifting the identity of Christians. I also think and something I hadn't mentioned before, is his edict directly impacts and causes Christians to follow after an example of a very important figure who is not on my list, but he kind of is a shadow figure with Constantine, which is St. Anthony. And St. Anthony's example of pursuing desert monasticism becomes a draw for these early Christians, or these Christians post-toleration, who realize, oh, my identity as a persecuted Christian has changed. I now live a life of more ease, more comfort, and even more authority and power. But that is different from and moving away from the church we see in the New Testament, the church we see in Acts, and the church that perhaps Christ even wanted to create out of his life. And so you have these Christians trying to pursue some of those elements, going into the desert, ridding themselves of their material possessions, of their comfort, their ease, any authority that they had, and pursuing Christianity that is pared back, one that has a different form of persecution, which is more of a bodily kind of persecution, or saying, like, I will lay down these things that I have. I will lay down these comforts in order to pursue Christ in the way that I think the Bible has told me to do. So we have an interesting cause and effect relationship between Constantine and St. Anthony. And so I think he's also embedded in that discussion, though not certainly not at the same time. And then his edict and Constantine's edict and the consequent councils are also really important in paving a way for larger doctrinal debates, as we will see at the end of Unit 1 and into Unit 2. So Constantine, I'm not going to keep talking about him. I've already talked a lot, but that's why I would have him at least on my list as number 4. Sam, who's your number 4?
Well, I feel like you just did my job for me, because my my number 4 is St. Anthony. Now, I think what's interesting, I'm going to talk a little about Constantine here, because you kind of did the Anthony material, which is great. I don't have to do it. It sounds like you wanted to put Anthony at number 4 on this list. So I think Constantine is one of the interesting figures to think about when you're making a list like this, because I think if I have him on my list, he's probably number 1. He probably shapes this world, more than almost anyone, the world that we're looking at in this course, because it is almost immediate we get this shift into how Christians live in the world. So as I was looking at my list, my debate was, do I put Constantine at 1, or do I say I'm not going to put him on my list at all? And I went to not put him on my list at all. And instead, I wanted to put Anthony on there as the people following in Anthony's tradition. Anthony goes into the desert long before Constantine. When Constantine issues the Edict of Milan, Anthony's already been out in the desert for a long time. I think Anthony maybe outlives Constantine. Anthony lives for like 106 years, so he might even outlive. But what's more important are the people who follow, as you pointed out, the people who follow Anthony's example as a way to push back against the wealth and comfort of this new imperial church. Now, the last thing I'll say about Anthony and why I think he's important is that he represents this move towards monasticism. And as we'll see going forward in this course, we're not going to be without monasticism going forward. It's going to take different forms. It's going to look different. It's going to be responding to the religious cultural context around it. So people following the Desert Fathers and Mothers, these folks are responding to something happening in the culture around them. 200 years later, we're going to see something else happen at the beginning of Unit 1. We're going to see a new form of monasticism. But Anthony really is in some ways the father of this monastic movement, this sort of, how do I live a life set aside, dedicated to God? We're going to see this again and again and again. So he's on my list at number 4. I think I have to have him on here. Andy, who do you have at number 3?
Yeah. Clearly, I wanted to put Anthony, and he's just kind of there, right? That's a great number 4. So my number 3 is Perpetua, for a lot of those same reasons you mentioned with Anthony, where Perpetua is a great example of Christian identity at the time, also the identity of a Christian woman. So Perpetua, I put her up higher on my list than Constantine because she is one of the few female voices that we get in Unit 1 at this time. It is hard to find some material of women, Christian women,
And she is important because she's emblematic not only of persecuted Christians, but the experience of women, of mothers, of pregnant women. And it's an example, she is, of the extent of cultural paterfamilias, or the head of the household being the man. I think she's symbolic to an entire generation of Christians. Again, she's from North Africa, which was a hub of Christianity at the time. She endures persecution. And at this time, persecution of Christians waxes and wanes throughout the early church. It a lot of times depends on who is in charge. But the central question of many Roman emperors is, what do we do with Christians? What do we do with these people who are outside of our culture and who are also deemed as dangerous or unfamiliar at the very best, right? So Perpetua is an example that we have of a red martyr in this course. She happily wants to endure persecution, even with her father begs her not to, and begs her to recant her faith. She doesn't want to take it back, and she doesn't want to renounce her Christianity. She says, this is who I am. Even unto the loss of her family, the loss of her parents, her child. And so there's a question again of civil disobedience and of faith. And how far are we willing to deny cultural values around you for the sake of your faith? And I think that she is one of the most difficult people in this course for me to empathize with, because of how absolutely different our upbringings are. Even though there's elements certainly of her family structure that might linger into the West in the 21st century, it is difficult for me to think of myself being in a place where I would have to choose between family, faith, and my own life. So that's why I have her as my number 3. Sam, who's your number 3?
Well, we made our lists independent of each other, and these sort of dovetail perfectly, because I also have Perpetua at number 4. I'm going to just piggyback on a couple things you said. I agree entirely about sort of historians are often looking at the silences, right? What are the voices we don't have? So it's significant that Perpetua writes a firsthand account of her life experience, in particular the experience of martyrdom. And I think this is important because if we think about the first 3 centuries of Christianity, so leading up to 313 and the reign of Constantine, the idea of persecution is one of the sort of major experiences that Christians have in the Roman Empire, right? And this is actually the thing that fuels the growth of the church, right? Tertullian says the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So Perpetua stands in for all of those Christian martyrs who are persecuted, who are killed, and whose testimony, whose witness, the word martyr means witness, whose witness really leads to the growth of the church. So I think I need to have an example, because that is such an important experience in the early church. So I think we need to have an example of martyrdom in there. So so she stands in for the Polycarps of the world, the Stephens of the world, all of those Christians that we don't know their names, who stood in arenas and were slaughtered for their faith to give this kind of witness. So I like having Anthony and Perpetua here together, sort of speaking about the 2 different ends of the Constantinian pivot, right? Perpetua represents pre-Constantinian Christianity, and Anthony represents a version of post-Constantinian Christianity. Because if the first 300 years it's about, can the faith live through persecution and martyrdom? After Constantine, it's, can the faith survive now that Christians are endowed with wealth and power and comfort? That those are the big questions in those that the early church faces. So I think those 2 people do that really well. So I agree with everything you said about Perpetua. I think she's really, really significant and important. Who do you have at number 2?
Yeah, so my number 2, I knew I had to have one of the 3 philosophers, Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle. So I was like going between which one. I think if I'm looking at it personally as Annie Berglund, I love Aristotle. I love his love of nature and studying biology and the world around us to find truth. But I didn't put him as my number 2, and I didn't even put him on my list. Instead, I chose Plato.
as a predecessor to Aristotle, I don't think the teacher is more important than the student. I'm not trying to argue that, Sam, even as a teacher myself. But I think that Plato is really important for establishing how we view the soul, and how ancient Greeks view the soul. And those differences. For the Greeks, the soul is us. It's our whole beings, everything that we do. It's our actions are guided by the three parts of the soul, right? So every decision we make involves the soul. So the soul is the appetite. It includes the appetite, the physical needs, the physical desires. It includes the spirit, our emotional responses, our cravings, our feelings of anger or shame, both the good emotional responses and the bad or negative emotional responses. And then it includes the mind, which gives rational calculations to our actions. It controls the appetites. It controls the spirit's interactions with our appetites. And it helps you to keep this balanced, moderate action in your life. So I think where certainly Aristotle is, in some ways, I would argue, a more active individual in pursuing practice and putting our thoughts into our actions in the natural world, in the world around us. I think that there are elements of that within Plato's philosophy as well. And one of the most influential readings for me as a student in CWC 12 years ago, however long ago it was the Allegory of the Cave. And so in a nutshell, we have Plato contemplating truth and how we find knowledge. And one of the big facets for that, the main one in the Allegory of the Cave, is becoming educated or enlightened. And that will help you become unshackled and bring you out of the cave and help you see truth in ideal forms. As an educator, that is an allegory that I think is incredibly important for why I chose to do what I do. And it's also important in terms of how we understand education as a culture. It's a pivotal part of our society. Our government funds it. It runs our society in so many ways. And when a state has an education that's underfunded, undersupported, you see that manifest itself in different aspects of the state. It doesn't just belong in education, but we see it trickle out to much more. And I also find his idea of coming out of the cave, feeling the brightness of the light, and that is first what you feel. You first feel stressed or discomfort from finding a truth, from contemplating and being enlightened on something, and then you're able to adjust. And I think that is what I want out of educating students. That's what I want out of educating myself, is to feel the discomfort of being educated, but then also overcoming that and engaging it and wanting more truth. Certainly, we've talked in these webisodes about Plato's influence on the Bible. Certainly not a direct influence in that he was hundreds of years before, but his influence on biblical authors, that it's embedded in a lot of the New Testament specifically. And he has continued influence in this course, CWC, as well. We're going to see him come up time and time again in Unit 2 and Unit 3 in this class, so make sure you know that. And philosophers for the next 2,000 years after Unit 1 are challenged by his beliefs, are fans of him, are in a disagreement with him, and write about him explicitly in their readings for this class. So I think he's truly foundational as an individual for how we understand the world, how we understand each other and ourselves, how we understand what is good and what is the good life, and what we should pursue as Christians in life too. So that's why I have Plato as number 2. Sam, who's your number 2?
It's interesting that you said that, personally you're more of an Aristotle person, but you picked Plato, because personally I'm more of a Platonic person, but I went with Aristotle, actually. And I think the reason I put Aristotle on here, because I had the same debate. I want one of the 2 philosophers or 3 philosophers. And I picked Aristotle because he really does have a burgeoning scientific view of the world. And actually, Aristotle's going to be the first word on science until we get to the 17th century AD. So for about 300 years, the science of Aristotle is kind of the science of the West. And, even though his ideas get overturned by people like Newton and folks like that, the idea of saying truth can be found in the physical world, and that, you know, in that way, I really do think he represents that shift from mythos to logos. I think he represents maybe the culmination of that shift. If we think about that running through Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, I mean, when you talk about Plato in the forms, you know, there is something that is spiritually about that. And Aristotle doesn't reject the forms. He just says, like, I don't know that I can really get my head around that. I can't really look at the forms. I can't use my senses to know those things. So he says, but I have all this stuff around me. And if I study that stuff, maybe I can get a sense of the forms, right? For him, form is immanent. It's in the thing itself. Um, and I think if we're thinking big picture about Western values that, you know, trickle down to us today, I think this sort of scientific worldview, scientific understanding of the world, a search for some sort of scientific understanding of some sort of scientific method. Um, you know, I think Aristotle, we can see the roots of some of that. Now, again, let's not confuse Aristotle with, you know, 17th century science, but I think he's laying the groundwork for that. And I think, you know, when Newton talks about standing on the shoulders of the giants who came before him, I mean, Aristotle's one of those people, right? So I think you can't go wrong with putting any of these philosophers on this list, but that's why I have Aristotle. Annie, we've made it to number one. Who's at the top of your list?
Okay. The top of my list, I am proud to put it, but I'm also a little bit ashamed. And I'm going to flesh it out. So my top is Alexander the Great. He's my number one. He is someone where if you like power, you like Alexander the Great. I'm not somebody who's ever been powerful. So for me, that's where the little bit of shame comes from. I've never really been into like military history. Kind of glaze over it. Like when someone's giving me instructions for a game, I'm just like, okay. But I put him on not because he's an incredible warrior, not because he's highly intelligent, not because he inherits the kingdom of Macedonia and he spreads his empire into the Far East, not because he's a conqueror. Sure, all of that is very interesting and important. But I have him on my list because of his influence. That's not just militaristic, it's not just geographic, but it's cultural. And I think that's why he's such a fascinating figure and an important figure in Unit 1 for CWC. And apparently, I think he's the most important for Unit 1 in CWC. He helps to establish and spread this Hellenistic world. All of the territories that he conquered have this Hellenistic or Greek-like aspect to it. And that's not just to say, these places were named with Greek names, or people started to speak a common language. That's not what we're talking about. It's more than that. Books were spread throughout his empire. Language, food, architecture, literature, the strategies for educating people, military strategies, like all of these things are spreading throughout his territories. So yes, he's a military genius. Yes, he's a person of power, but he also helps to establish through his territories and through his deep interest and love of Greek culture as a Macedonian, he establishes local languages and customs surrounding Greek thought. So yeah, the local languages still remain. We still have the customs of those local territories, but Greek schools pop up and religious institutions pop up. And it encourages Greek philosophy, culture, theater, sculpture, poetry throughout his territory. And this is immensely important for the Bible and for Jesus. And we talk in this class about messianic expectations in Judaism, that you'll have somebody who's going to overcome occupation of foreign powers, like successors of Alexander the Great. And so you can see how we could connect Alexander with the Maccabean revolt, for example, of you have an uprising against a power that looks similar to Alexander the Great. And similarly, we have Greek language and culture embedded in our Bible. And so it makes it possible for the early church to grow because you have a common language or a common kind of cultural background. The New Testament itself is written in Greek because that's the common language that's able to transfer and transmit throughout the empire.
And then certainly Platonic dualism, Greek imagery, Greek metaphors, all of these are found in the New Testament. Now, attributing this all to Alexander the Great is doing him a great service. Like this is giving him more credit than he deserves. I understand that, but I truly believe that he is a central figure in even in the story of Christ, of making this the fullness of time. This time in which Jesus was born was perfect for Jesus's mission. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the culture and the territory that Alexander had set up hundreds of years before. Sam, what's your number one?
My number one is very different than Alexander the Great. I do sort of love how there's a kind of symmetry to this, and you pointed this out when you were talking about your number 5, Tertullian. I do have Augustine at number 1 here. In part, I can slip Plato in here because Augustine is very Platonic, deeply influenced by Plato. He says when he reads the works of the Platonists, he can see the gospel in them, which I think Tertullian would be rolling over in his grave hearing that. But I think I talked about Augustine a lot in segment 1, so I'm not gonna rehash all of that. But I do think he is the person who's interpreting the events of Unit 1 as we move into Unit 2. He is our hinge figure from Unit 1 to Unit 2. And he is helping Christians to wrestle with the Constantinian world. In the same way people like Tertullian and Perpetua were helping Christians deal with the pre-Constantinian world. Augustine is doing that for the post-Constantinian world. And arguably, we're still living in a fairly Constantinian world for most Christians in the West. And definitely for most American Christians, the idea of actual persecution for your faith is not something we can even really get our head around. There are plenty of Christians in America who like to talk about sort of, feeling persecuted for their faith, but I think we should maybe take a step back and look at people like Perpetua and Polycarp and folks like that and say, are we really being persecuted for our faith, or are we just encountering people with different ideas? I think we need to be careful about that. And I do think we live in a pretty Constantinian world, and Augustine is the one who is helping us think about how do we live in that. So he changes the way we think about our relationship to power, our relationship to military power. Augustine is saying, well, if there may be instances when going to war might be just. It might be the necessary thing for us to do, not because it's what God wants, but because as limited human beings, right, that this is a way we can establish some kind of peace, some kind of limited harmony in this world, knowing, again, to hold those things loosely. So he just casts too big of a shadow. You're not going to get away from him as we go through the rest of this course. So he's definitely number 1 on my list. Students, now it's your chance to vote. We have a poll up on Moodle. So you can vote for who you think has the superior list. Is it Annie's list with her 2 political figures of Constantine and Alexander the Great? Is it my list, which is a little bit more theological, philosophical, maybe? I avoided people like Constantine and Alexander. I think those are 2 very different approaches, 2 legitimate approaches to this. So go on to Moodle, vote for who you think has the best list. We will be back in a few seconds to wrap up the show.
Welcome back. It's happy time. Happy birthday to Tom Cruise. The actor turns 61 today, which is unreal. Cruise has appeared in 48 films in his career with a collective worldwide box office gross of over $12.2 billion. His 49th film, Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1, comes out next week, July 12th. Sam, what is your favorite Tom Cruise movie or role?
I struggle with this because for one thing, I'm not a huge Tom Cruise fan. Like, I'm not like a Top Gun fan. I watched Top Gun when I was a kid. I watched Top Gun Maverick. That's not my thing. But I particularly love the movie A Few Good Men from 1991. I think that's a great Cruise movie star role. I think he's really good in that. So it's either that. That's probably the movie that I like watching the most that he is in. But my I think maybe the best performance of Tom Cruise's career is in Jerry Maguire from 1996. I think that Cameron Crowe wrote a perfect role for Tom Cruise, and Cruise nailed it. And the fact that he doesn't have an Oscar for that performance, I mean, again, what do I care whether Tom Cruise has an Oscar? But he deserves it. That's an Oscar-winning performance, and he didn't get it. So those will be my picks, somewhere split between A Few Good Men and Jerry Maguire. Annie, happy anniversary to Ziggy Stardust. On this day, 50 years ago, David Bowie announced that he was retiring his stage persona alter ego. Annie, you are a fan of Bowie, and you even have a cat named Ziggy. What is so great about David Bowie, Ziggy Stardust?
Look, Ziggy Stardust lasted for about 1 year. It was an onstage persona that he just jumped on and then like left just as quick. I'm gonna let Wikipedia answer this question for me. So Wikipedia says Ziggy Stardust is an androgynous alien rock star who came to Earth before an impending apocalyptic disaster to deliver a message of hope. After accumulating a large following of fans and being worshipped as a messiah, Ziggy eventually dies as a victim of his own fame and excess. What is cooler than that? Like, that's his 1 year persona, an androgynous alien bringing the message of hope.
We just don't have rock stars anymore.
I know. Okay, happy trails to Andy Griffith, who died on this day in 2012. Sam, why should students in 2023 go back and watch the Andy Griffith show from the 1960s?
I would say because it's genuinely a very funny show. There's lots of like 50s, 60s sitcoms that are like, yeah, you can appreciate why somebody might have liked this, but they're not actually funny. Back when my kids were little, they went through a stretch where they were obsessed with the Andy Griffith show. And what's great about it is not Andy Griffith particularly. He's fine. He's not particularly funny, but it's the cast of characters, people like Don Knotts playing Barney Fife, or Howard McNear playing Floyd the Barber. They're just actually super funny physical comedians, verbal comedians. If I can recommend 2 episodes, if you want to get your feet wet here, season 2, episode 11 is The Pickle Story. That is a classic episode. Very, very, very funny. Some great Don Knotts there. And then season 2, episode 20 is Barney and the Choir, which is maybe one of the funniest episodes of the Andy Griffith Show, and one of the funniest episodes of 1960s TV. So either of those are great places to start if you want to get your feet wet with the Andy Griffith Show. Annie, we are running out of time, but students, I want you to remember, go on to Moodle, vote for Food Chain. Who has the best list of the 5 most important figures from Unit 1? You have no assignment for today. Instead, study, prepare for the exam. Remember, the exam is not tomorrow, July 4th, but it's Wednesday, July 5th. So you really get 2 days to study and to celebrate independence. After the exam on Wednesday, we'll take the day off on Thursday. We'll start up again on Friday. Our next webisode will drop on July 12th. So at that point, we'll be deep into Unit 2. Hopefully this was helpful. Good luck with your tests. Feel free to email me if you have questions. Say goodnight, Stacy.